And we had we'd gotten down to verse 6 of Isaiah 17. In verses 4 through verse 6, Isaiah deals with Ephraim's destruction, while the first 3 verses deal more specifically with Damascus and its destruction. He also introduces Ephraim there. But verses, we've got an old Auga horn going on. Forgot one little thing, and that's, of course, the one thing that goes off. Isn't that the way it always goes? Forget one thing, that's it. While Ephraim is introduced in the first 3 verses, verses 4 through verse 6 deals specifically with Ephraim and its destruction. Ephraim, of course, is the northern kingdom of Israel. So it's known by all of those terms or names. The northern kingdom, it's known by Israel, or here Ephraim. In verse 6 now, he says, "Yet the gleaning grape shall be left in it, as the shaking of an olive tree. 2 or 3 berries in the top of the uppermost bough, 4 or 5 in the outermost fruitful branches thereof." Bough, not bow? Okay. See, I can butcher the English language, English grammar or pronunciation, just as much as I can Greek or any other language. I'll probably still pronounce it next time. This destruction that he sets forth is going to be like the gleaning of grapes, the shaking of an olive tree. In other words, there's very few that are going to be left. And generally the ones that are left are, well, we would say worthless. They just no value. That's the ones who are left in this destruction of Ephraim. The top of the branches, or the, what was it, bough? I'll take a bow on that. The very top would be those that are just not worth reaching up there and getting. That's the idea. They're not worth the trouble. It'd be too much trouble to get them. So they're left there. The olive tree, they would reap it by beating on the trees and basically shaking the everything off, all of the fruit off. So there would, by that action, be some that remained on the tree that would not be taken or would not fall off, and as a result they would be left.
Some of the farmers even today that's got pecan trees or something like that, they got things hooked to their tractor, goes around the trunk of the tree
And
shakes it.
vibrates it.
And it knocks all of it.
Right. I didn't know that's how they did it nowadays, but that's the exact same thing. Except they would use, something else, a rod or something, to beat it, and you'd have all of the olives dropping off of it. And by the very nature of that, there's going to be a few left. They would say a good sized branch would generally leave 4 or 5 olives there. So that's showing the completeness of the destruction that is going to come upon them. Then in verses 7 and verse 8, you have a remnant of Ephraim is going to return to God. He says, "At that day shall a man look to his Maker, and his eyes shall have respect to the Holy One of Israel." So there's coming a time in that day when this destruction takes place that there's going to be some who place their confidence in God, the Holy One of Israel. When things are going well, that's the time in which people forget God. That's why, for example, in the United States today, it's so difficult to get people to become spiritual. There's no thinking about God because we forget God because everything's going fine. We don't need Him. Okay, Dale?
When you go to church on Sunday morning especially, it's so apparent. You don't see cars on the road. Very few people go to church. I don't have any inclination religiously anymore.
Even those who claim to believe in God, the majority of those don't even go to any religious group. They don't see the need. Pam?
I remember after the Twin Towers were hit and all the devastation and horror that went with that, there seemed to be a new awakening of people looking towards God, but it didn't last.
That's what I was going to add. Yes, after the Twin Towers collapse, and there's this sudden awakening and that sense of a need for God. But it didn't last. You're right. It was very short-lived. Well, even during the World War II, there was a great religious awakening that took place right after the war, during and after the war. But that really wasn't all that long-lived either. In reality, it was fairly short-lived. You start thinking about, when did the war end? 45? By the 60s, what do you have? Tune in, turn out, the anti-establishment dropout crowd, hippies, yippies, and all of that nonsense. 15 years. That's not all that long that religious awakening that took place during and immediately after the war lasted. Dale, what?
I'm just saying, materialism held its way and finally culminated in Obamacare and all.
Well,
Spirituality.
okay. It was a long time before that. But I was thinking back, you look at Israel, or Actually, Israel is not correct. Judah, the southern kingdom. There was a great religious reform by Josiah. Remember that? How long did it last? Not long. And they went right back into idolatry. Bill?
And all of the judges, just over and over again, they would sin against God. Some nation would trouble them, and then they would repent. God would send a judge to
Okay, the period of the judges, a repetition of that. Things going well, they fall away from God, they go into idolatry. Well, no, I take that back. They didn't go into idolatry so much, but they started following the ways of the nations round about them. They would go into oppression because a nation would overtake them and put them in subjection. They would cry unto God, and God would send them a deliverer. How many judges were there? 15? Over how long was the period of the judges about?
450 years.
Generally, it's stated as an average. We don't know the exact number, but generally given around 300, sometimes 330 years, thereabouts. And during that 300 years, 15 times they go through this. That's not staying faithful very long.
Judges 11, 20, 26, it gives a number. You want me to read it, or you just know, I refer to it. 300 years, I think it was.
Okay.
But I don't know whether it's from.
Well, that's the problem.
Go back to a starting point, what the starting point was.
We don't know when the starting point was on that. And so a lot of the dating is like that, especially when you get back into that time frame. That's why I say approximately 300 years. Some say approximately 330. I've even heard one person, I think, said 333. But that's not the point. The point is you have 15 different times in which they apostatize and go through this cycle. And so it wasn't very long. But also you see what's being pointed out here. Things go well, they apostatize. Things turn poorly. And can I add, when all else fails, what do? You turn to God. That's the last straw. And it sounds like a lot of people today. Okay, Carl.
look at when Moses went up to when he went to the mountaintop. These were the closest people will ever be to God. And
That's a
40 days.
That's a good illustration as well. Moses, these are people who had seen the plagues, experienced part of them. They'd come out of Egypt being able to take all of the gold and silver of the Egyptians as payment for their years of slavery. They get to the Red Sea, and here's the Egyptian army coming after them, and all of a sudden the Red Sea parts, and they're able to cross it on dry ground. And when the Egyptians tried, the water comes over and destroys them. They go to Mount Sinai, and they start to receive the law, but there's the shaking of the ground and the mountain and the thunder, the lightning, and all of these things, so that they're scared to death. And they tell Moses, you go up and get the law, because we're too afraid. And within 40 days, what have they done? made a golden calf. So that's right. That's a good illustration of the same principle, that it doesn't take long for people to apostatize. But what we're seeing here in verse 7, and the context of this, here's this destruction that's coming, and so what happens? A few of them turn to God. They look to the Maker, or His Maker. They look to the Holy One of Israel. So everything else basically has failed. And now then they turn to God. It's sad, but it is true that for a lot of people, catastrophe has to happen, I'll put it that way, within their life before they will turn to God. I know many occasions where someone who knows the truth yet won't do it, whether they might be a Christian who's apostatized, or just a weak Christian, or someone who's not even a Christian, and something catastrophic happens within his or her life, and then they turn to God. They will repent, or they will obey the gospel. I'll say this, that a lot of times, this is not always true, but a lot of times those individuals, when things get to going well, what happens? They go back into the very same thing that they were doing beforehand. And I say, that's not always the case, but a lot of times it is. Because when things go well, we turn our attention away from God. When things are going poorly, then we turn to God. And that's what you're seeing here with this verse. In verse 8 then, and he shall not look to the altars, the work of his hands, neither shall respect that which his fingers have made, either the groves or the images. It's at that time Israel will turn from their idols that they have made, no longer placing their trust in their idols. Probably the altars at Dan and Bethel might have been intended here. Someone turn over to 1 Kings 12 and read verses 28 through verse 33. 1 Kings 12, verses 28 through verse 33. 1 Kings 12, 28 through 33.
Therefore the king asked, King Sage asked advice, and they took it out of the gold and said to the people, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt." And he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. And this thing became a sin, while the people went to worship before the one as far as Dan. He made shrines on the high places, and made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi. Jeroboam ordained a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and also sacrifices on the altar. So he did at Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he had made, and at Bethel he installed the priests of the high places which he had made. So he made offerings on the altar which he had made at Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month which he had devised in his own heart, that he ordained sacrifices on the altar and burned incense.
Okay. This is Jeroboam. The kingdom has divided. Jeroboam taking 10 of the tribes, the southern kingdom, then under the rule of Rehoboam, had 2 tribes that was given to it. Jeroboam was afraid that if those 10 tribes, those Israelites, went to Jerusalem, that their hearts would be turned toward Rehoboam, and they would basically kick him out, put him to death, and they would go back to being under Rehoboam's rule. And so what does he do? He sets up 2 calves, one in Bethel, one in Dan, and said, here's your gods, and go to these places instead of going to Jerusalem to worship. And he sets up a worship. Of course, God had set forth the Levites to be the priest. He took, King James has the lowest of the people to be their priest. I think that was a New King James saying every class of people, basically. Instead of the sons of Levi. He sets up a different date for them to go worship. And there's a interesting statement there, which he had devised in his own heart. It wasn't instructions from God. He did this on his own. And as a result, he became that king who was known as the king who made Israel to sin. Became a sin unto the people.
Ecclesiastes 7:29 says, God has made man upright, but they have sought out many devices.
Okay. Yeah, and he did. But
And nobody seemed to have any memory of the past, because that's the very thing Aaron brought out, put before on my side.
that's they were destroyed there, and that's we forget the past. We don't learn from it. Same thing today. Okay, Bill.
In all of the kings of the northern kingdom, a lot of times it says they sinned after their father Jeroboam.
That's why I was saying his epitaph became "Who made Israel to sin." Why? Because he did this, and all of the kings followed after and actually became worse than he was. But he's the one who initiated it all. And so all of them followed after Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. But as we see here, the altars of men's hands probably specifically has reference to these idols that Jeroboam had made. But it also might include others besides those. Someone turn over to 2 Kings 17. Well, I'll just read it. 2 Kings 17 and verse 11. And there they burned incense in all the high places, and as did the heathen whom the Lord carried away before them, and wrought wicked things to provoke the Lord to anger. Now notice this, all the high places. So it's inclusive of more than just the 2 altars, the one at Dan and one at Bethel. You see this also in Hosea chapter 8 and verse 11, when it says, because Ephraim hath made many altars to sin, altars shall be unto him to sin. So there's many altars, not just the 2 that we began with as far as Dan and Bethel. There's additional ones now. And so while this might have specific reference to the ones at Dan and Bethel, it would also include all of these others. Okay, Dale.
One of the recurring phrases, and I forget the whole phrase, but it says, made this, that, and the other, whatever it was, under every high hill and under every green tree. The altars or idols or something, I forgot that whole phrase. Recurred repeatedly.
The high places, all of the high places, and it talks about those quite a bit. The groves or the images. The grove would be Ashram, which is the Canaanite fertility god, and the sun images. Pulpit commentary states, and this is a lengthy quote, but I think it will help us understand when the King James uses the groves, the images in particular. Quote, Asherah, the word here and elsewhere commonly translated grove in the Authorized Version, is now generally admitted to have designated an artificial construction of wood or metal which was used in the idolatrous worship of the Phoenicians and the Israelites, probably as an emblem of some deity. The Assyrian sacred tree was most likely an emblem of the same kind, and may give an idea of the sort of object worship under the name of Asherah. The Israelites, in the time of their prosperity, had set up groves of this character on every high hill and under every green tree, 2 Kings 17:10. Many of them were still standing when Josiah made his iconoclastic raid into the Israelite country, 2 Chronicles 34:5-7, and were broken down by him at the same time as the altars. The images of this place are the same as those coupled with the Israelite groves in 2 Chronicles 34:7, namely sun images, emblems of Baal, probably pillars or conical stones, such as are known to have held a place in the religious worship of Phoenicia. End quote. Basically stating that these terms are dealing with the Asherah of the Phoenicians and the sun images, emblems of Baal, that would also come from Phoenicia. So they had taken the idols of these foreign nations and brought them in, and that's what he's having reference to here when either the groves or the images. When two nations at that time went to war, they would place their trust in their God against the God of the other nation. Whichever nation won the war, guess whose God was the strongest and the greatest? The one who won the war. Now then, that was the thinking of people back in that time frame. Thus, when we see here that they are going to turn away from these idols and turn to God or Jehovah, you're seeing that these gods have failed us. And so we're going to now turn back to Yahweh. That's what's taking place in this situation. They failed. So let's tear them down and get rid of them because they didn't help us out. And now then look at this situation we're in. Maybe Jehovah will help us. So that's what these two verses are embracing, verse 7 and verse 8. In verse 9 then, and going through verse 11, Isaiah is going to deal with the cause of their doom. And we might very well say the cause of their doom really is their idolatry, but he's going to deal with it here in these verses. In that day shall his strong cities be as a forsaken bough, and an uppermost branch, and which they left because of the children of Israel, and there shall be desolation. So a remnant remains that are faithful to God, but the nation itself apostatizes. The nation as a whole, thus, is going to feel the wrath of God against them. They are forsaken. The once strong cities are now destroyed. They become desolate. They are like an empty forest. Kind of inconsistent terms there. Because if it's a forest, it's not empty, is it? But here's where a forest was, but it's now empty. That's what they are now, like an empty forest. The forsaken bough are leavings of woods. That's basically the idea. You have an axeman that's coming, and he gets the tree, but what's left behind? Well, a stump, but also a lot of limbs, boughs, a lot of shavings. Have you ever seen someone who will cut down a tree and then pick up all of the little wood chips? Be kind of foolish, wouldn't it? Because it'd take too much time. No, not really. As to whether it makes good firewood or not, they still leave the chips and all of the other aspects of it. Well, as a forsaken bough, that's what he's dealing with. These limbs that fallen off, they are forsaken. They worthless now. So in verse 10, because thou hast forsaken the God of thy salvation, and hast not been mindful of the rock of thy strength, therefore shalt thou plant pleasant plants, and shall set it with strange slips. When you see the word because, what do you know? What's it telling you? Here's the reason why. That's what it's telling you. Now, therefore, Paul, what does therefore do?
What happened before all of that happened? This is what's going on forward.
therefore is a conclusion based upon what has been stated. Here's the statements. Therefore, this. It's a conclusion based upon that. Because this is what's taking place. Here's the reason that it is taking place. You could almost, and doesn't hold true exactly, but you could say, here's this and this, therefore this, because this. And the because gives you the reason that that's taking place. So, why is this in verse 9 taking place? Here's the reason. And it is, they have forgotten the God of thy salvation. They have not been mindful of the rock of thy strength. They have forgotten God. They've not been mindful of Him.
God had told them to teach their children in Deuteronomy 6, and then later Josiah had a guy, I forgot who it was, find the book of law in the temple, and they hadn't apparently been doing that.
Okay, Deuteronomy 6, they were told to teach their children. They were to talk about God all of the time before their children. Remind them of all that God has done. They didn't do it. The king was to read the law every year, I believe it was. They didn't do it. They forgot God. How long does it take to forget God? Well, using the illustration that Carl brought up with Moses when he went up to the mountain, 40 days and they forgot God. And look at all that God had done for them during the preceding days. Didn't take long. Israel's going to be desolate. Why? Because they forgot God. How many of you have heard the statement concerning the church that we're one generation away from apostasy? Probably heard it hundreds of times through the years. It's closer than that. We could say that it is upon us in reality. The third generation is a dangerous generation. If you go back to the start of Judges, it talks about that the people of my mind just went blank of his name. Joshua. The people who lived with Joshua, they remained faithful. The next generation remained faithful. The third generation apostatized. The third generation is a dangerous, because the first generation, they remain faithful generally. The second generation, they're not as faithful. You start seeing a turning away, that the desire, the interest of that first generation is not there. The third generation, there's apostasy that takes place. Now, that's not always true, of course. But speaking in generalities, that's what we see taking place. Pam, and then I'll get you, Carl.
Okay, just my mind went to Galatians, Paul saying, talking to the foolish Galatians, I love them quickly, and that's probably the
the same generation, because of false teachers with Galatians. The Galatian brethren were being troubled by the Judaizing teachers. You have to keep the law of Moses if you want to be saved. Be circumcised. And so Paul fought that, and yes, they were so quickly removed from him who hath called you into the grace of Christ into another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you, would pervert the gospel of Christ. Galatians 1, 6, and 7. And thus, in chapter 3, I believe it's verse 1, he calls them, O foolish Galatians. I thought it wasn't wrong. I thought it was wrong to call someone a fool. Sometimes it's right, sometimes it's wrong. It's depending on how it's used. But they were foolish. Why? Because they had left God.
Yeah, no one's immune. Look at David was a man after God's own heart, and Solomon was the wisest man.
David and Solomon, David did with his was not so much falling away from God. His was just a matter of weakness and sin within his life. Solomon, though he married so many wives that turned his heart away from God.
How many generations has it been since the 50s when the United States was on the pinnacle of the Church of Christ?
During the 1950s, the church was the fastest growing religious institution in America. Now then, what is it? Our numbers are declining. Post-World War II.
Take away
So,
examples of leadership, and it doesn't take long. That's what Paul told the elders. After my departure, he was having tears. He knew what was going to happen. It didn't take long.
didn't take long. Someone made a post in Facebook, Brother Richard Massey, and I don't think he's ever been here, but I've known him for many years. I've known him longer than I've been alive. But he made a post about that all congregations essentially die out. Name one congregation that you see in the Bible. Where are they today? Not a one of them exist. So I asked him, through his experience and what he has observed, how many years does it take before a congregation might be a great congregation, but before it dies out? And of course, dealing with round numbers in this, but he said probably about 100 years at the most. Well, it might not be. That was just a figure he threw out, but I kind of thought it would have been shorter than that as well, in which a congregation goes from a good, sound congregation, maybe doing everything that God wants them to be and to do, and within that short time frame, they cease to exist. They don't exist anymore. Yeah, it doesn't take long. And that's just historical situation that you're dealing with. Do we want it? Of course not. But it's the reality of the situation. Whether it's young people that aren't taught and do not continue on in faithfulness, whether it's apostasy, preachers that start teaching false doctrine, or elders who don't do their job in overseeing the congregation, or general worldliness, or whatever it might be, congregations cease to exist. And he was in one of his responses referenced a congregation that used to exist in Fort Worth. It was, how many of you have heard of Brother Leroy Brownlow? It was a congregation that he was part of. They started no telling how many congregations in Fort Worth. They would reach a certain growth, and when they reached a certain number, they generally would go out and start another congregation. Doesn't exist now. And the congregation does not exist. A lot of times that is the case, that people scatter, they move off, and they're someplace else. But we're talking about the congregation itself. They cease to exist.
What percentage of the problem is division?
Problem of division, that obviously is a part of the problem. Is it all of the problem? Obviously not. But the sin of division and divisions that take place in congregations, it is a major problem. There's no doubt about it. And that does lend itself to a congregation ceasing to exist. We'll stop there since it's past time.